Ahoy! We have some very interesting new information about New World and its player activity in various different scenario situations, different types of game modes. So far we have been able to track the player numbers through the Steam charts, but that doesn't really give us further insight into what players are doing, how many players we have in total, because it only measures the current peak, the concurrent players, and generally speaking, not too much detail. That is all changing now thanks to the leaderboards, which gives us a ton of new insight that we couldn't get to beforehand. To have a solid overview first, let's look at the Steam charts briefly and talk about the trends there. What we can see there are a few different values. One that I always find particularly useful are the average players, which you can see here starting from January 2022. We go up and then we can also see the peak players on the other side here. And what you will see if we look at the stats here, so look at March for example, these are the peak players, not the average players. So this graph at the top always reflects the peak, which isn't necessarily the most telling information. I think average players actually tells us a lot more than peak. That really tells us how many players are playing most of the time across the day, whereas peak is just the highest point of the day. And if we look at that throughout the month here, we can see that it's gradually going down, especially towards the middle of 2022. Makes a lot of sense. There wasn't really much going on and everyone was waiting for Brimstone. And then here around August, it starts ramping up to the 45,000 player peak and then goes all the way up to 137,000. If we're looking at the peak Brimstone week, as well as, I think this must have been around the same area that Fresh Start came out, right around here. I don't think this is measured separately. So a lot of players for a short time, and then it goes down back again. And now we are reaching peak players down here in February of 28,000, which are not exactly the best numbers, but obviously this doesn't tell us everything. These are just the peak numbers and the average players. So it is kind of reflective of what we had last year-ish, pretty much around almost the same time, around March, around April. We're looking at 21,000 average, now we have 23,000 average. But these are no longer the only numbers we have. XR has provided me with a ton of data from the leaderboards that tells us the total number of players for various specific things. So for example, as of 2 days ago, when Lazarus was still the mutation, we had 15,373 groups that had cleared a Lazarus M10 with gold, because if you measure by clear time, it'll only show you achievements or people that have achieved this with the gold rating. However, group totals don't tell us everything here, because the number of unique players for these clears was nearly 18,000. This means that most groups actually ran more than one run, which makes a lot of sense because any farm run, any speed run will usually be more than a single run, and especially Lazarus, because it's often farmed for shards, is a mutation that many people would repeat quite a few times. But it did still somewhat surprise me, considering a group is 5 players and we're not seeing not even double the value in terms of player numbers compared to groups. So really a lot of people probably also running with multiple different groups, but definitely very few people only just doing one run in that week. And this value is even more drastic if we look at the groups that had the maximum score rating, which is basically all players that ran Lazarus, because it's not requiring you to get gold. Any score is counted on the scoreboard here. This was a total of 23,252 groups with 20,016 unique players. Now it is worth noting that the leaderboard data for mutation runs in particular had a lot of low quality data. You may be aware of some of the issues leaderboards had, first not working at all for mutations and just making your entire leaderboard stuck, and then the refresh issue. So I wouldn't 100% rely on these values to be accurate. The values that we have beyond that, however, seem to be very much on point. With slightly updated data from roughly a day later, we had nearly 19,000 Lazarus Gold M10 runs, which is a pretty solid number. Keep in mind that Lazarus in particular is getting ran more than most other mutations, as far as I'm aware at least. We'll see more data on that soon. But generally speaking, I know of a lot of players that specifically run Lazarus just to farm cheap charts, even if they otherwise don't run any expeditions or mutations, simply because it's quick and easy. So overall we have a relatively high value of unique players here. We have an even higher value of Outpost Rush players though, with 26,771. All of the numbers here and all of the numbers that follow are unique players. So that means if a player does multiple Outpost Rush, that will not increase this number. So I guess in a way this can finally answer the question how many PvP versus PvE players we have, indicating that we have more players doing OPR, but then again we are also only looking at gold M10s here, and if we're looking at all levels of mutations, which is a lot more data and a lot more complicated to gather, but then we would probably be seeing overall very similar numbers, considering mostly people will look towards M10s, but there will still be quite a few people doing lower level mutations. But of course, we have more than one PvP mode. In Wars, we had around 12,000 players. Actually, pretty surprising in my opinion. I did not expect Wars to have almost half the player count of OPR. Considering a lot of people generally consider Wars a very exclusive activity, the player number of players that actually has touched a war in recent days even, it doesn't seem to be that low. It makes sense that with the territory changes in general, people are more able to enter wars, so obviously that would increase the number of players that are able to access wars, but still, I think this is a positive outcome. And interestingly enough, arenas have almost the same player count as wars, with 12,300-ish. So OPR much more popular than arenas, no surprise here. I think a lot of people just do their arena for daily gypsum, to be honest, based on what I've seen in my arena games. And OPR allows for many more players at once, the pressure is definitely not as high for most players, and it also rewards you much better. To me, as an arena enjoyer, it is relatively sad that such a quick and easy PvP mode has fallen out of favor so much that it's almost the same values as War, which takes a lot more arrangement before you can get into it. But especially if you also want to get a better perspective of how many PvE or PvP players we have, we also need to understand how many players are doing multiple of these activities at once, because we can't just add all of the totals for OPR, War and Arena when many players do OPR and Arena or OPR and War. For that we have specific stats of players that appear on both leaderboards. In case of Outpost Rush and people who have done a Mutation Level 10 Gold Run, this is 8,200 players roughly. We can compare that to the number of players who have done either both or one of these activities. These numbers are slightly outdated, they are a day older than the other numbers, so they should be a little bit higher. In this case, it's around 35,000 players. So maybe you'd add another 2,000-ish here maybe, and then subtract the 8,000 from the players that have done both. That would end up at 29,000 players that have done either an OPR or a Gold M10, but not both. Unsurprisingly, this overlap is much higher between players who have played in Outpost Rush and participated in a war. The number of players here who have done both is 8,600-ish. So this is much closer to the total number of players in wars, which was around 12,000. So we only have around 3,400-ish players that haven't done an Outpost Rush and have participated in a war. Again, the combined number here is likely closer to 30,000, but overall we still have a lot of Outpost Rush players that haven't done a war, unsurprisingly. Not everyone gets into wars, but everyone can go into Outpost Rush. The crossover of players that have done Arena and OPR is even higher, unsurprisingly considering they're both easy to queue modes. What we can also see through this is that 3/4 of all Arena players have also played in Outpost Rush, so very few purely dedicated Arena players. Another thing I really wanted to know was how many players participated in a war and also run M10 mutations. Here our overlap for an M10 gold completion and an M10 score completion is almost the same, with around 4,500 players for both. In other words, around 1/3 of all war players also did mutations. This could possibly drop in weeks with less popular dungeons or less farmable dungeons though. Between the amount of war players that still did some OPR or participated in mutations though, I would say the number of actual war loggers that literally just log into the game for wars seems to be surprisingly low. When it comes to exclusivity of wars, I also have a little bit of insight. On Delos in particular, there were 472 players in wars as of the point when it was measured. At that time, on the leaderboards patch, this particular server had 7 wars. That means, since every war has 100 players, the total number of players in these wars would have been 700. Knowing that we had 472 players, we can just subtract that from the 700, and we find out that there are 228 duplicates, so players that participated in more than one war, though we have to keep in mind that there could also be people that have participated in 3 or 4 or 5 wars, and they would take multiple of the numbers here. But generally speaking, it looks like there is quite a decent mix of different players participating in the wars, though obviously this could look different if you tracked it over a longer time span with more wars. However, I figured it was important to get this information now because some of the leaderboards will basically never fully reset, or not for a long time, and in this first week we can get some data that we can never get again in the same way. Now, a big question remains: how many players actually did something in the game in total? I can't give you a complete answer to that. There are certain things that just hadn't been tracked yet, and certain things that are more difficult to track or would take longer. But between the players that have participated in an invasion and gotten a score there, or played an arena, or an outpost rush, or a war, or a Lazarus M1-10, or multiple of these activities, there was a total of 51,490 unique players. This doesn't account for certain other activities. This doesn't account for people that are purely just gathering, or people just logging in for the trading post, or people just logging in to craft materials. And this also doesn't include people who are just doing chest runs. So there is a lot more stuff that could be covered here, but this at least gives us a good indication of the actual number of fairly active players. Given that our peak player number in the Steam chart still sits at 43,000, I would assume that the overall number of players is still a fair bit higher, and there are just a lot of people that happen to log in just to do non-tracked activity, and often I'm one of those myself. So while I don't have an exact number, I'd guess that we at least have like 60 to 70,000 players that do something in the game. These numbers are not only interesting for now, but also to see in the future how the player count develops when a patch drops, for example, and we get significant updates. Because it could be that this affects the whole player base across the board, or it could be that, for example, if a new expedition is introduced, the actual number of expedition runners goes up, but other numbers are mostly unaffected. We'll have to find out in the future. I will of course update you when we have any new information on that, so consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you want to get notified. That'll also notify you of the next part of my weapon perk breakdown, if you're interested in that, and also of some Smite videos that are coming this week. Huge thanks to XR for providing me with this data. This is incredibly useful, and I will hopefully be able to look more into that in the future again. And also thanks to my patrons for supporting this video. Thanks for watching. Dixloth out.